The 1986 explosion of the Challenger marked a tragic moment, not only for the friends and loved ones of the 7 astronauts aboard the doomed shuttle, but for the nation as a whole.
It was meant to be one of the most moving moments in American history, a sign of progress, bravery, and the potential of people. Millions of people around the world watched the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger from Cape Canaveral, Florida, on January 28, 1986. There was a civilian school teacher on board for the first time, Krista McAuliffe. Kids all over the country sat in classrooms and watched live, ready to see history happen. But instead, they saw a nightmare happen. At 11:38 a.m., the Challenger took off from the pad. Its 3 main engines roared to life, and its twin solid rocket boosters lit up the sky with fire. As the shuttle rose higher and higher, a bright white column cut through the cold January air. The crowd below cheered. For 73 seconds, everything seemed to be going well. Then, all of a sudden, everything went wrong. In the clear blue sky, a fireball that blinded people burst. There was trash everywhere. People gasped in disbelief. Mission Control stopped talking. The commentator stuttered on the live broadcast as he tried to figure out what he was seeing. Then, through the static, a voice said something that would always define the moment. Obviously, a major malfunction. For years, NASA told everyone that the crew died right away. They called it an explosion, which is a sudden disaster that no one could have survived. They said it was quick, kind, but the truth wasn't that easy. The Challenger did not go up in flames, it fell apart, and there were still 7 astronauts alive inside the wreckage that was falling. NASA didn't want the story of what really happened to the Challenger crew in the last 2 minutes and 45 seconds to get out. It was about the choices that led to it, the desperate fight for survival that followed, and the creepy reason the truth was kept secret for so long. It was very cold the morning of the launch. Engineers had never seen ice on the launch tower before a shuttle flight. The temperature stayed just above freezing, which was bad for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Big rubber gaskets called O-rings sealed those boosters. Their job was to stop the 5,800-degree ignition gases from leaking out through the seams between the booster segments. The O-rings worked great at normal temperatures, but when it got cold, the rubber got stiff, less flexible, and took longer to seal. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that made the boosters, knew that this was a big problem. Roger Boisjoli was one of them. He had been telling NASA for months that the O-rings might not work in cold weather. Boisjoli and a few of his co-workers had an emergency phone call with NASA officials the night before the launch when the temperature dropped into the 20s. They begged the bosses not to start. They showed charts, data, and years of experience. They said that the O-rings couldn't guarantee a good seal below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The weather report for launch morning said 26. NASA managers, on the other hand, were under a lot of stress. Weather and technical problems had already caused the launch to be pushed back several times. The press was getting impatient. The public was paying attention. The Teacher in Space program had brought more attention to this mission than ever before. Politically canceling again was risky and embarrassing in public. People were shocked and angry when the engineers brought up their problems at the meeting. A NASA manager told them straight out to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. Morton Thiokol's executives went against their better judgment and gave the go-ahead for the launch. The choice had been made. Challenger left the tower at 11:38 a.m. Commander Dick Scobie and pilot Michael Smith were in charge of the shuttle's perfect descent from inside the cabin. Everything seemed normal. Challenger, go at throttle up, said Mission Control. Roger, go at throttle up, Scobie said calmly. The crew's last words were those. A camera caught a small puff of dark smoke near the right solid rocket booster less than a second after liftoff, which was exactly where the engineers had warned it would be. The flight went on as usual for the next minute. The smoke went away. The shuttle looked like it was stable, but the damage was getting worse inside the right booster. The O-ring didn't seal properly, leaving a small gap. For a short time, molten aluminum and debris from the burning fuel blocked the hole, stopping disaster. The plug broke at 73 seconds when the shuttle sped through the area of highest aerodynamic pressure. A stream of white-hot flame shot out of the booster and burned right into the huge external fuel tank. There were more than 1.5 million pounds of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in that tank. It was a dangerous mix that only needed a spark to start. The tank broke open in a matter of seconds. The hydrogen caught fire, making the huge fireball that millions of people saw. But that fireball wasn't an explosion like most people think of. The orbiter, which is the part of the shuttle that carried the crew, was not damaged in the explosion. The huge aerodynamic forces ripped it apart. The reinforced crew cabin broke free, still intact, and kept going up for another 25 seconds before gravity took over. Then it started to go down. The 7 astronauts inside stayed stuck in a powerless shell for the next 2 minutes and 45 seconds, falling 65,000 feet toward the Atlantic Ocean. NASA told the world that the crew died right away, but the evidence says otherwise. When the cabin was finally brought back from the bottom of the ocean, investigators found something very disturbing. 3 of the astronauts had turned on their personal egress air packs, which are small emergency oxygen tanks that are meant to be used in a cabin that is full of smoke or fumes. These air packs did not work on their own. An astronaut had to reach over and pull a bow lever to turn one on. That was something you did on purpose. It meant that at least 3 of the crew members, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, and maybe Commander Scobie, were still alive and aware after the breakup. For a long time, NASA hid that information deep in a technical report. It was never brought up in the news. Families were only told that their loved ones had died instantly. But the truth, which was hidden behind bureaucratic language and secret findings, told a different story. The crew had made it through the breakup. They were aware. And for a short, horrible time, they were trying to stay alive. The cabin had lost power, which meant it couldn't control the pressure. As the cabin climbed above 60,000 feet, The air inside quickly thinned. There isn't enough oxygen to breathe at that height, and you can pass out in seconds. But as the cabin fell, the air pressure outside started to rise. At some point during the fall, the air would have become thick enough to breathe. Even though it was full of smoke and fumes, the astronauts probably turned on their air packs at that time. Think about how quiet it is. The lights are off, the instruments are broken, and the Earth is spinning below. The crew was strapped into their seats and couldn't talk to mission control. They were falling into complete darkness. It's thought that at least 2 of them woke up and tried to stabilize the cabin with the few controls they had, even though all of the flight systems were broken. It took 165 seconds for the fall to happen. Then, the cabin hit the ocean at more than 200 miles per hour, which no one could survive. It took NASA's recovery teams weeks to find the wreckage, which was resting 100 feet below the surface. Divers found the cabin mostly intact, though it was badly damaged and still recognizable. The bodies of all 7 astronauts were still strapped into their seats inside. NASA quickly put a strict media blackout in place. No pictures, no information, and no press briefings. They only said that crew compartment recovery efforts were underway in an official statement. Investigators knew the truth was terrible, but they kept it to themselves. The Challenger crew did not die in an explosion. They had fallen for almost 3 minutes, which is something that no person should ever have to go through. NASA didn't tell the families everything. Some officials thought it was a kind thing to do. Some people thought it was a way to protect themselves. The world mourned after the disaster. Over and over, TV networks showed the footage again and again. The bright plume of fire, the twisting trails of smoke, and the shocked silence that came after. Classes were canceled at schools. Kids who had seen the launch live were sent home early. It was a day that would stay with me forever. But as the sadness grew, people started to ask questions. How could this have happened? How could NASA, the organization known for being safe, precise, and perfect, have let such a terrible failure happen? And why did it seem like they were completely ignoring some questions? NASA's first official statement called the event a explosion. It was a word that was used over and over again in news stories, press briefings, and speeches. The word made it feel like it was over. It meant instant death, since no one inside could have lived for even a second. It was comforting in a bad way. A quick end meant no pain, no panic, and no fear. But behind the scenes, investigators were finding out a much darker truth. The Rogers Commission, a group of people chosen by the president to look into the matter, was set up to find out what went wrong. Richard Feynman, a physicist who won the Nobel Prize, was one of its members. He was a man who wouldn't accept clean explanations. Feynman was shocked when he started going over NASA's data. There was already proof that the O-rings were wearing down and getting damaged. It had been there on other shuttle flights before. For years, engineers had raised concerns, and in internal reports, the O-rings were listed as a criticality 1 risk, which meant that if one of them failed, it could destroy the shuttle and kill the crew. This was something NASA already knew, and they kept flying anyway. Feynman said the situation was an institutional failure of honesty. In a famous public hearing, he showed everyone how the problem worked. He sat down at a table, took a small piece of O-ring material, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. He held it up and bent it after a while. The rubber didn't bend. It broke. He said, "This is the problem." That simple demonstration cut through years of technical jargon and PR spin. The crowd went quiet. There was no denying the truth. The engineers had warned that the cold weather would make the O-rings brittle, and they were right. But the fact that the O-rings didn't work wasn't the only thing NASA hid. As divers kept pulling pieces of the shuttle out of the Atlantic, they found that the crew compartment was still in one piece. There were things inside that told a scary story. Checklists still attached to control panels, switches set in ways that could only have been moved after the breakup, and 3 activated air packs. There was only one conclusion that made sense. The crew had survived the shuttle's first destruction and were still alive, at least for a little while. NASA never made public pictures of the cabin that was found. The official story was that the pictures were too graphic. But some people who were close to the situation later said that wasn't the only reason. They didn't want the public to see how well the structure was holding up. People would start asking questions as soon as they saw that. Could they have been saved if the crew cabin had survived? The painful truth was that there was no answer. There was no way for the shuttle to get out of this kind of problem. There was no way to stop once the solid boosters caught fire. There was no parachute, no eject system, and no way for the crew to get out of the vehicle in an emergency. When the breakup happened, the cabin was thrown clear, but couldn't do anything. They had no choice but to fall. The thought that the astronauts might have been alive and aware during that long fall was too much to bear. Everyone who worked on the recovery mission had nightmares about it. For years, many of them wouldn't talk about it. In early March 1986, the Navy ship USS Preserver used sonar to find the crew cabin on the bottom of the ocean. They sent divers down, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. The cabin had hit the water hard, but it wasn't broken up. It was mostly still in one piece, but the impact caused a lot of damage on one side. The cold seawater kept the astronauts' bodies safe while they were still strapped into their seats. The discovery led to an immediate media blackout. The recovery operations were called sensitive. Reporters were told to stay away. Families were only given a few updates. People were only told that debris had been found and would be looked at. There was a quiet sense of horror inside NASA. They understood what the results meant. The failure of the O-ring could have been avoided. The warnings had been ignored. The crew had been alive long enough to know that something was wrong. And the comforting myth that the public had been told about instant death was not true. In the weeks that followed, There were heated arguments within the organization about how much to share. Some people said that the families had a right to know everything. Some people said that telling the whole truth would only make things worse. Dr. Joseph Kerwin, who was in charge of NASA's Life Sciences Division, wrote the official medical report on the deaths of the crew. He chose his words carefully and on purpose. He said that the orbiter's breakup was so violent that the crew may not have known what was going on. The word may did a lot of work. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't even a comfort. It was a carefully placed layer of doubt that made the horror less scary without going against the evidence. Many people at NASA privately admitted the truth to themselves. The astronauts were probably awake for part of the fall. The G-forces may have made them pass out for a short time, but they came back to life as the cabin stabilized. The fact that the air packs had to be turned on by hand showed that at least some people were awake and trying to do something. That truth was never officially told to the families. Instead, they were told a story that was easier to deal with, that their loved ones had died quickly and without pain or fear. Some people later learned bits of the truth through reports and testimonies that got out. Some people decided not to ask. The cover-up wasn't meant to hide a survival conspiracy or secret rescue attempts. It was something much more ordinary and much more dangerous. NASA's lies were built into the organization. They had kept risks hidden for years, silenced people who disagreed with them, and put safety behind their schedule and public image. The Challenger disaster wasn't just an accident. It was the result of a system that put more value on looks than on warnings. The results of the Rogers Commission's investigation were very bad. The report said that NASA had a flawed decision-making process, a culture of denial, and too much pressure to stick to an unrealistic launch schedule. There were no shuttle flights for almost 3 years. The agency completely changed how it was run, but its reputation was already hurt. Even though reforms were starting, some truths stayed hidden. They were hidden in secret appendices, technical reports that few people would ever read, and the memories of people who had seen the wreckage with their own eyes. For decades, people believed in the myth of instant death, not because it was true, but because it was easier. NASA has an easier time, more convenient for the public. Families will have an easier time. The real story was too much to take. The crew of Challenger fell for almost 3 minutes, alive and aware in the silence between the stars and the sea. But the most scary part isn't the fall itself. It didn't have to happen. That morning, the Challenger launch should never have happened. There had been every sign of trouble. The information was clear. The engineers who had worked on the shuttle program for years were almost begging for someone to hear them. But in the end, ambition won out. Politics won. Pressure won. The shuttle program was no longer just a scientific project. It had become a symbol of American power, technological progress, and the hope that space travel would one day be as common as air travel. There was more to each launch than just science. It was all about how things looked. NASA knew that how people saw things was important. The government and the public were told that the shuttle was a reliable, reusable space vehicle that could fly dozens of missions each year. Delays put that illusion in danger. People were led to believe that the shuttle was always safe, but it wasn't. Engineers were aware that some of its most important systems, such as the O-rings, had very little room for error. They knew that one mistake or one wrong condition could lead to disaster. But NASA's culture inside the company rewarded being hopeful and punished being careful. People didn't see problems as red flags. They saw them as things to get over. Richard Feynman was the most outspoken critic of NASA's way of thinking when the Rogers Commission made its findings public. He wrote an appendix that NASA first didn't want to include in the final report. He looked at the agency's public statements about safety and its private risk assessments and found a huge difference between the two. NASA's leaders told the public that there was a 1 in 100,000 chance that a shuttle would fail. However, engineers working on the program thought the risk was as high as 1 in 100. Feynman put it all into one damning sentence. For a technology to work, reality must come before public relations, because nature can't be fooled. What he said came true. There wasn't just one broken seal or one cold morning that caused the Challenger disaster. It happened because the system had been ignoring its own warnings for years. And after that failure, 7 astronauts, Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe paid the ultimate price. The story that NASA told in public turned into a carefully planned story. The astronauts were shown as brave heroes who died right away on a mission for science and exploration. It was the kind of story that people could cry about and then forget about. Clean, sad, and easy to understand. But the truth was anything but simple. Teams were gathering evidence that told a different story behind the closed doors of NASA's recovery operations. The crew cabin is in good shape. The air packs that were turned on turns on control panels that had been moved after the divorce. Everything pointed to the crew having survived the first event and having tried, even if only for a short time, to take back control. A piece of the cockpit's internal tape recorder kept investigators up at night. Most of the orbiter's systems stopped working right away, but the crew's intercom recorder kept recording audio for a few seconds after the breakup. When NASA finally looked at it, they found a short burst of static, a few soft clicks, and then one voice, thought to be pilot Michael Smith, saying, "Uh-oh." That was all. 2 words that were hard to hear over the noise. Then there was silence. NASA wouldn't let anyone hear that recording for years. No one ever heard it. The transcript that was finally made public only confirmed what the recovery evidence had already shown. The crew had lived longer than anyone wanted to admit. NASA's identity was based on success. If they had admitted to this kind of failure, it would have ruined that image. It wasn't just the sadness of the families. It was about keeping the space program alive. People had to trust that the missions would get money in the future. Telling the truth about the crew's survival, their fear, and their suffering would have been terrible for morale and the agency's reputation. NASA hid the truth. They told a shorter version of the story. They said the event was an explosion. They stressed that death happened right away, and they went on. The bodies of the crew were quietly returned to their families, without any fuss. Officials were not clear, only saying that the crew died in the explosion. People inside NASA who knew all the details were told not to talk about them in public. The technical reports that talked about the air pack activations and how the cabin was still in good shape were put away and were hard for most people to get to. A lot of engineers felt guilty in private. Roger Boisjoli, the man who had tried to stop the launch, was heartbroken. He later said that when he saw the fireball on TV, he knew right away what had happened and that it was exactly what he had warned would happen. He would spend years talking, writing, and testifying about the disaster to make sure it never happened again. But the scariest part of the story is what happened after the Challenger tragedy stopped being news. The shuttle program started up again after a while. NASA promised to make changes, make things safer, and make it easier for engineers and management to talk to each other. But less than 20 years later, the same thing would happen again. The Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry on February 1, 2003, killing all 7 crew members. Once again, engineers had warned that there was a problem. This time, it was with the foam insulation on the outside tank that could hit the orbiter's wing. People ignored those warnings again. Once more, tragedy that could have been avoided happened. History had happened again. People had learned from Challenger, but then they forgot what they had learned. This made a lot of people uncomfortable because it made them wonder how many other truths NASA had changed, buried, or rewritten to protect its public image. The Challenger disaster is more than just a sad event. It shows what happens when institutions put more value on how things look than on how they really are, when warnings are ignored because they are too hard to deal with, and when the truth is replaced by a story that is easier to believe. The real story isn't about 7 astronauts dying all at once. 7 astronauts trusted the system that let them down. It's about a group of engineers who tried to stop a launch they knew would fail. And it's about the silence that came after that. A silence full of secrets, guilt, and the desperate hope that no one would ever find out. The Challenger didn't just fall from the sky in the end. It took away the idea of perfection. It showed the flaws in people that led to the technology's failure, the ambition, pride, and fear of failure that had blinded the whole company. Failure is not an option, was NASA's motto. But in 1986, failure was unavoidable. And what made it really scary was that the people who could have stopped it didn't. In the weeks after the Rogers Commission's report came out, NASA was at a crossroads. The agency had to face up to its own mistakes. But even then, a lot of the truth was still hidden behind layers of bureaucratic language and careful wording. People heard things like failure of judgment, management miscommunication, and structural malfunction. They didn't hear words like preventable, overruled, or ignored. Internal memos showed that the culture had become numb to risk behind closed doors. Flight schedules were tight, there was a lot of political pressure, and public relations were very important. NASA wasn't just sending astronauts into space, it was selling a dream. The Challenger disaster, though, had ended that dream. The pictures of the shuttle breaking apart in the sky haunted the whole country. Teachers cried in front of their students. Kids who had seen Krista McAuliffe's smiling face on TV started to think of spaceflight as a tragedy instead of an inspiration. The sense of wonder that had defined the space age disappeared in a matter of seconds. No one knew this better than the people in charge at NASA. They knew that the truth, the real truth, would destroy the last bit of trust they had. So they made a decision. They would be in charge of the story. They would choose what to release, cut out anything too dark, and change the story into something people could accept. The first thing that happened because of that choice was a lack of honesty. The Challenger mission's technical data was either classified or hidden in appendices that almost no one would ever read. The recovered crew cabin was kept very safe, with guards on duty 24 hours a day. It was finally buried in a sealed silo at Cape Canaveral. To this day, that wreckage is still buried, out of sight of the public and untouched by history. Families of the astronauts were told vague things about the recovery. They were told that the crew died right away, that they didn't have to suffer, and that the physical evidence was too sensitive to share. That version of events was easier for a lot of people to deal with. But some of the families, especially those with ties to NASA, started to hear rumors, quiet confessions from engineers and investigators who couldn't keep the truth to themselves. One of those whispers was about turning on the personal egress air packs, or PAPs. The technical report, which was buried deep in the Commission's findings, confirmed that 3 of them had been turned on by hand. It wasn't just a guess. It was true. That one thing made all the difference. It gave the crew time to respond. It meant that at least some of them had been awake. NASA never said it wasn't true. They just didn't say anything. When reporters later asked for more information, the agency said, "There's no conclusive evidence the crew survived." It was a smart thing to say because it sounded like it was true, but didn't really say anything. Not lies, but omission hid the truth. Not everyone at NASA liked the silence. Some people wanted the truth. Some people were afraid that telling the whole truth would end the shuttle program. There were billions of dollars, decades of work, and thousands of jobs at stake. If people lost faith in NASA, funding would dry up, and NASA itself might go away. So, silence was the rule. People thought of the Challenger as a tragic accident, not a failure that could have been avoided. People called the astronauts heroes, and they were, but their deaths were seen as the cost of exploration, not as a result of pride and carelessness. But not everyone kept quiet. Over the years, reporters, engineers, and people who used to work for NASA spoke up. They showed ignored warnings, pressure to stay on schedule, and memos from Morton Thiokol saying that there were O-ring problems on almost every flight. NASA was aware. They said it was a reasonable risk. That phrase became a ghost that haunted the shuttle era, the reasoning that turned deadly risks into numbers on a chart. The Commission told the truth. Feynman made it clear, but time erased the specifics. The simple story of an explosion, instant death, and heroism became more believable, easier to teach, easier to grieve. But every engineer knew that the truth went down with the ship. The proof was on the ocean floor. The cabin was still there, the switches were flipped, and the air packs were on when they fell. Divers said it was eerily quiet, and the dials were stuck in the middle of their movements. To them, it wasn't trash. It was proof. Proof that the crew lived long enough to find out. Long enough to give it a shot. NASA never changed what it said. A sudden catastrophic failure. No pain, no fight. Other evidence said something else. Some people said that NASA's silence was kind. Some people called it lying. It could be true that both are true. NASA spared the families and itself. The truth would have ruined its reputation, its money, and its dream. So they let the dream go on. But it cost them their honesty. That's what makes Challenger so scary. It's not just a tragedy. It's how the truth gets buried when it hurts too much to face. It's how ambition makes you lose sight of what's right and wrong, and how myth takes the place of responsibility. People saw a ball of fire. NASA saw the end of being innocent. The crew saw the sky get dark and the ocean rise to meet them. The Challenger disaster didn't just kill 7 people. It also ended the idea that things are perfect. It showed how pride can change the truth, how great dreams can cast long shadows, and how bureaucracy hides the truth. NASA promised to make things better. The fleet was grounded, the systems were rebuilt, and safety was improved. For a time, it looked like they had learned. But Columbia burned up when it came back in 2003 because people didn't listen to warnings, didn't communicate well, or put their faith in the wrong things. The same pride had come back. It wasn't just an accident the Challenger happened. People who thought they were right built it step by step into a tragedy. Physics destroyed it, but people made choices that sealed its fate long before that cold morning. That's why NASA kept the truth a secret, because the truth wasn't just hard to hear, it was bad. The 7 astronauts, Scobie, Smith, Onizuka, Resnick, McNair, Jarvis, and McAuliffe, did not die right away. They got into a fight. They reached for hope when there was none. 3 of them even took their air packs. NASA wanted people to remember them as heroes, not as people who were scared and still fighting to breathe. Fear of losing faith, money, and control drove the cover-up. But pain doesn't go away when you don't talk about it. The wreckage of the Challenger is still sealed under Cape Canaveral. Every year, NASA remembers the crews who died on Challenger, Columbia, and Apollo 1. But there's a truth that is too heavy to say under the tributes. They were aware that it could happen, and they still let it happen. It's not just about rockets in the Challenger story. It's about being responsible and how honesty is often less important than image. When you see that fireball in the sky, think about what happened next. The quiet wasn't the end. It was the beginning of 2 minutes and 45 seconds that changed history for good. Death didn't come right away for the crew of Challenger. They were awake, they knew, and they kept fighting until the end. And that's what makes the truth so scary. Make sure you sign up to get more stories they tried to keep from you.